Hello, and welcome to the ProjectWise Administrator Advanced Accreditation course on Managed Workspaces. This is the third part of a four-part series about what might go wrong. In this third part, we will specifically discuss general configuration issues. This lesson will present an overview of what might go wrong. In other words, troubleshooting. In this part of the lesson, we will discuss general configuration issues. These are just general things that you might come across in troubleshooting a managed workspace. Specifically, we will talk about what might happen when you're importing client workspaces, things that you might need to look for. We will look at catching typographical errors, and we will look at an issue where ProjectWise doesn't always delete files and leaves residual files. We will look at that general process and then specifically look at how it affects the DGNWS process. So as a quick hint, it's always good to keep in mind the major framework variables, and I consider these almost like a mailing address. And then if you get one part of the mailing address wrong, things are going to fail. So you have things like country may be equal to configuration. Your state and province might be equal to workspaces root. The city might be the workspace, the street worksets root, and the house number or building number becomes your workset. Each of those need to add together to create a full configuration. And so as a troubleshooting routine, those are the portions of the configuration that we constantly need to check to see if we find things are loading correctly or not. Let's first talk about importing configurations. The first thing you will want to do in troubleshooting an imported configuration is verify the functionality outside of the managed workspace. This has a number of simple steps. The first thing you will want to do is read through the configuration files and just get familiar with the configuration. You will want to identify the framework variable locations as well as any other custom variables that the workspace may include. One of the advantages of getting a configuration to work outside the ProjectWise environment is the ability to use additional configuration analysis tools. A full discussion of these tools is beyond the scope of these lessons, but I do want to mention a couple of them. The first is the -debug command line option. The use of this tool is fully documented in the online help for MicroStation. A second, more advanced option is called Bentley Configuration Explorer. This tool emulates the configuration load process and has additional capabilities to see the load order of configuration files and the history of variables. More information about this can be found by simply searching for Bentley Configuration Explorer online. So what are the typical issues you might encounter with importing a configuration? As we mentioned earlier, custom variables and local framework variables. If you find these and they're interfering, what you might want to do is set and lock these prior to loading. So we could do things like we did with the validation configuration, where we set and locked the worksets root. So if there's anything that we see might interfere with that, we can potentially set those ahead of time, like at predefined level or any time in the configuration before it reaches those configuration files. Another thing we want to look at, especially with Connect Edition, is do they provide a template project? In other words, a work set. Connect Edition has a lot more functionality in the projects, especially with the standards portion. So we will want to make sure that the workset standards are included in the configuration, or we will want to create one. We then want to ask these questions. Where is the worksets root and the location of the workset CFG file? Where is the DGNWS file? And where is the workset standards location. And once you get this defined, we would recommend creating a company template so that you can recreate these projects easily. If these terms are confusing, I recommend that you go back and look at the configuration basics lessons. A couple of variables you want to make sure that you verify are USTN workspace standards and USTN workset standards. There are other additional standards locations for other products, like Open Roads has Organization Civil, Open Buildings Designer has building data sets, and ProStructures has its structural workset standards. So there are a few application-specific locations that you will need to check. We'll discuss that a little bit further in the application implementation guides lesson. Let's next talk about typographical errors. What are the causes of typographical errors? Well, there are really too many to mention. But what we can talk about is how to trap these types of errors. The best way I have found to do this is through intentional temporary error statements. You can temporarily place error statements in key locations like files or maybe inside logical statements to verify these files or portions of a logical statement are included in the process. By doing this, you can narrow down where errors may be occurring. You can also verify the existence of paths with if-exist statements. If there is ever a typo in a variable path, by having standard validation statements, as we showed previously, these types of typos become very evident quickly without a lot of wasted time. Well, let's now review troubleshooting DGNWS issues. First, we will discuss DGNWS file creation in ProjectWise. ProjectWise Explorer will automatically create a DGNWS if it does not exist. Without going through the specifics, let's just say it utilizes the DGNWS variables and templates if they are defined. These are the primary variables used that affect the DGNWS. From a troubleshooting point of view, it's most important to note that MicroStation first creates the DGNWS in the DMS folder. If ProjectWise detects that this file is being created, it then imports the DGNWS into the ProjectWise environment. This process will be demonstrated as part of the residual files discussion a little later. Let's talk about the DGNWS mismatch now. The handling of mismatches between the active file and the defined DGNWS has changed from version to version. This is true for both the MicroStation product and ProjectWise Explorer. In earlier versions, you may see the mismatch message. However, in later combinations of versions, you may not see a mismatch, even if there is a mismatch. If the mismatch does cause a problem, there is a fairly simple solution. One situation where I have occasionally seen this as an issue is when the file being opened was copied from a previous project and is branded with that previous project. But the DGNWS for the current project has not yet been established. So when it is opening, there is both the action of creating the DGNWS and checking for the mismatch. In cases like this, to clean this up, there is a fairly simple little process. First, you check out the file. You open the file directly in the local DMS folder with no workspace and no workset. Run the key in file disassociate workset. Then either key in file save or select save settings from the menus. This will clear up the mismatch message. The next thing we want to talk about here is residual files. Sometimes in ProjectWise, when you delete a file or rename a file, the workspace has already copied out that file to the local DMS folder, ProjectWise just does not handle that situation very well and often leaves a residual file in the DMS folder. So the best thing to do is to purge local copy before renaming or deleting. However, this does not solve the problem with that file having been copied out on another user's local machine. So there's actually a difference here between workspace content files and CFG files. In the managed workspace process, the managed workspace will only load those CFG files that have a document record in ProjectWise. Even if a residual file exists in the DMS folder, it will not be read, and we'll go through an example of that. However, MicroStation, if there's like star.cell, something of that nature, it will load all files that pass that wildcard that exists in the DMS folder. And we'll show an example of that as well. Looking at configuration files, for example, we have a configuration file, and I've got 4 files as an example. Residual files 4. Say we rename that to residual files 5. What happens then in the local DMS folder is we have both a residual files 4 and a residual files 5. However, when the managed workspace processes that, there were variables I set in those files, and we see 1, 2, 3, 5. 4 was not included because the managed workspace was smart enough to only include the files that have document records associated with them. However, in workspace files, potentially I have 4 cell libraries. I rename one of those similarly to cell library 5 rather than 4, which then means I have an extra cell library in the local DMS folder. And the result of that becomes that I end up with 5 cell libraries listed in my available cells. What are some solutions to this? Well, you can delete the file locally in the DMS folder. The con is this needs to be done at each local instance. Solution 2 would be to purge all workspace files in local document organizer, check in all files, delete all DMS folders. Again, the con to this is that this needs to be done at each local instance. One more encompassing solution would be to recreate the folder in ProjectWise, therefore creating a new DMS location. However, this does mean the files need to be copied out again, but that would be the case for solution 2 as well. And this does affect your audit trail because you're creating a new folder instance. However, that might be necessary to make sure that all the files are cleaned up in the local instances. Let's then look at an example of how this affects the DGNWS process. So what we're going to do is purge our workset DGNWS. We're going to delete the DGNWS, open a file, review the creation of the DGNWS and how that works in ProjectWise. We'll delete the DGNWS without the purge, open the file again, review the creation of the DGNWS, and see how when there's a DGNWS residing in the DMS folder, ProjectWise does not create a new DGNWS as a document record. It thinks that the DGNWS still exists and doesn't create a new one. So we would delete the local DGNWS, open the file, and evaluate. Let's now look at that process. As mentioned, the first thing we want to do is purge the DGNWS file. Then we will delete the DGNWS file. We then look at the DMS folder ID and we see that the DGNWS file has indeed been purged. Next, we then open up any file. We see the DGNWS file is created during the opening process. We also see that a DGNWS file was recreated in the worksets root folder. Let's check in the file. Now let's delete the file without first purging the DGNWS file and see what happens. The DGNWS file still remains in the working directory. Let's now open the file again and see what happens here. This time we see that a DGNWS file was not created, but we did not get a no workspace, no worksets alert. So now let's delete the local DGNWS file. And open the file again. We see again that this time the DGNWS file was created. We then check our worksets folder, and we indeed see that a DGNWS file was created this time. So what did we learn in this? We looked at what happens when importing configurations or general things to consider. We looked at catching typographical errors, and we also looked at residual files, as well as the DGNWS process in ProjectWise Explorer.
If you found this video helpful, please give it a like. If you want to see more such series, consider subscribing to our channel. Thank you, and see you next time.